Hello and welcome to the Sustainability Experts Podcast, a podcast that brings you helpful advice on sustainable business. I'm your host, Vanessa Thompson, and in this episode, we're covering decarbonizing the built world with our distinguished guest, Philip Hoare. Philip is the Chief Operating Officer at AtkinsRéalis, a globally renowned engineering and design consultancy with operations in over 160 nations. Their projects range from energy infrastructure to transportation, and they're now leading the way in investing and operationalizing sustainable infrastructure. Philip, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Vanessa, and great to be here.
Well, I know that I've introduced you, but I would love if you could kind of give your story and your personal journey in terms of how you integrated sustainability into your leadership.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm a very proud civil engineer, and I became a civil engineer because what we do is about effectively creating things for society, and so everything that you see around you, is in some way passed through the hands of an engineer at some point in
Hmm.
time. So everything in our built environment, from the way we produce energy to the way that we travel to the homes that we live in, and I was always really motivated by that as a passion to drive me, and so that's why I became, I guess, came into this type of industry that I'm in. But as time has gone on, and we've really begun to understand the impacts, the devastating impacts that climate change has on our society and the way that we live, and obviously the real pressure there is, I think, globally to act and before things become even worse than they already are. And
Yeah.
but then also, what you need to do to prevent that from happening. And there is as much that we can do to decarbonize now and to help reduce the impacts of climate change. But that whole piece about being sustainable and being resilient, for me, go absolutely hand in hand. So, as a company, we have a vision around engineering a better future for our planet and its people. And, clearly I had a hand in developing that purpose. And
Yeah.
but for me, it's a personal purpose, and I believe that my organizations like ours, can
Hmm.
work with companies around the world to help them decarbonize, plan to be more resilient for the future, and make a difference.
Yeah.
And it's a global journey. I don't know whether you can read the writing behind me, but it says "Together changes everything," and I think that's an absolute tenet on which we need to follow if we're going to make a difference to protect our
Yeah.
planet and the people that live in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that slogan, together we change. And I'm wondering, it's, particularly in a competitive market, it's very difficult to collaborate on particular climate actions as one. And I'm wondering, do you have any kind of case studies or examples of that working out successfully where, two companies, even in a competitive market, were able to work towards these specific actions as one towards decarbonization?
I think often companies are working in joint venture or working in partnership. So that's a commonplace thing in our industry. That
Mhm.
projects are of such a scale that it requires several organisations to come together to help deliver it. And so
Yeah.
in that particular environment, absolutely, there are some great examples of how they would take a particular scheme forward. And
Hmm.
but I don't think it's commonplace to look at the general solutions. One
Yeah.
area that I've been involved with, this is a UK example, but the UK government asked us to look at something they called it the business of resilience. And it was about trying to bring together the infrastructure engineering sector in the UK and the insurance sector, which is housed out of London, global insurance housed out of London, and saying, actually, is there a different way that we can look at resilient solutions? So this is about dealing with the impacts of climate change rather than decarbonisation. But could we come up with a different model to look at how do we close what is a growing insurance gap? So people not it can't afford the insurance. Take parts of Florida, for example, and so becoming very, very difficult to insure, and the cost of insurance is so high. So is
Mhm.
there something you could do differently, that rather than plowing money that you would use to fund a disaster after a disaster's happened, can
Mhm.
you channel some of that into a new model that does upfront infrastructure that helps
Yeah.
mitigate the impact of a climate change? And in the US alone, in 2022, there were $28 billion plus insurance events driven by climate impact. And it was about 10 years ago, so there's almost like an exponential curve kicking in
Yeah.
of how that happens. So I think that's an example of trying to say, okay, how can these two industry sectors work together well? And I have to say, I got some great collaboration across industry, thinking about, how could this model work? How could it move forward? And there are a couple of examples now of businesses, working together to try and develop a different solution in different places. And actually, I spent some time in the US. I did a sort of tour up the East Coast, starting in Florida, then into Washington, and then onto New York. And we were looking at is a UK government to US government trade mission, and to basically look at, how could we share the practice from the UK? Does this resonate in the US? And could we make this work in a different way? And that's been really, really useful, I think. And some great work, particularly with Miami-Dade, to think about, how do we cross-share knowledge and cross-pollinate knowledge. So I guess that is an example, isn't it? It wasn't on a specific project, but we're talking about, how do we use different models to try and deal with climate resilience in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's incredible. And I know you mentioned, the, digital twin technology, but also the city simulator. And these are really interesting. And I think particularly for our audience who, may not be as familiar with climate resilience, but this is really, really important to potentially, model natural disasters and think about mitigation strategies. What are the impacts going to be? What are the damages going to be this year or this month or today? Not just a 10-year out, kind of philosophy on climate change in terms of mitigating carbon emissions for the future, but really thinking about what are we going to be dealing with today and what are the business outcomes and operations that we need to be thinking about for that reality. And I think that that's a whole new way to kind of perceive sustainability that a lot of business people are still kind of shifting to. But I would love to kind of delve in a little bit more to the city simulator because I think it's a really interesting technology. And, can you talk a little bit more about this technology and some of the insights that you've gained from it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let me explain City Simulator first. So, City Simulator is actually quite simple. It takes models a city, and so effectively creating a digital twin of the city, which is pretty straightforward. And then what it starts to do is apply what are the impacts of climate change on that city. So for example, water level rises if it's coastal, looking at the impact of flooding. And there are lots of predictions around rainfall, over the next 100 years and how rainfall patterns will change. So, you start to look at the impacts of flooding. It looks at, for example, the impacts of temperature increase. And so if you model 1.5 degrees or 3 degrees or even 5 degrees, actually, what does that do in terms of creating hotspots in particular cities? And then when you look at that, you can say, okay, well, if there's a 5-degree temperature rise impacting certain parts of this city, what does that do to healthcare? What does that do to our lives? What does that do to impact the elderly at times of it, prolonged periods of extreme heat? And what knock-on effect might that have on my healthcare system, on my transport network, on how I organize my city actually to be able to deal and check with those changes? And so City Simulator, for me, is really about, I think the modeling is accurate enough for you to get a picture of the types of impacts will happen on your urban environment. And from that, you can start to make different decisions about how you might handle those impacts. You might make different decisions about how you model your city and what you do and how you change that around. So for me, it's it's a great example of how we can use data and technology to give us insight and to change thinking and ultimately to make different decisions. And because this is all about making the right decision, isn't it? And if you take a look at the US, for example, the US I think is a good example. Across every state there are flood resilience maps. If you're going to buy a home, you can look up what the impact of flooding will be in that particular area. More sophisticated, I think, than anywhere else in the world. And but actually, how do you turn that data that you've got and that insight at the moment really used to think about, can I get insurance on my home, and turn that into how do we plan differently? And when I was in New York, met one of the boroughs was talking about the impact of flooding and impact of water level rises on the Hudson, and they were talking about basement flooding on properties right next to the river, and the severe impacts that was having. But interestingly, the management technique they were thinking about, they actually called it a managed retreat. Actually, we're just going to have to abandon shoreline properties, and because that's the only way of preventing. There've been a few deaths of people that had died in flooding incidents who were homeless people that were living in basements of these buildings, and so actually manage retreats the only way. And you think, well, surely there's got to be a better way than managing retreats. And so City Simulator is just a way of sparking that conversation and allowing our town planners, our urban master planners, our provincial, local, city governments begin to make different decisions about how they manage their assets going forward. And I mean, the fact is, it's too late for us to stop the impacts of climate change. And, we are feeling them, over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And whilst we've got to have a decarbonisation story that absolutely runs in parallel with dealing with climate change, we have to act now on the climate disasters that we know are going to happen. I don't know whether you saw, a few months ago, the devastating impact of floods in Dubai, and if you haven't seen that, you need to look at it on YouTube. It's crazy, and and the government of Dubai, I think super shocked. They're going to invest 30 billion dirhams in looking at how they prevent that type of disaster happening again, and so what's that? It's about 10 billion US, and so they are looking immediately at, how do we prevent that type of disaster happening? And actually, interestingly, the only way to do that is to build infrastructure to manage it. And so going full circle back to engineering a better future for our planet and its people, engineering plays a huge part in obviously how we resolve that.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of applications of this technology in a lot of cities that need it. I know New York particularly has done a fantastic job in terms of thinking about their climate resilience, actually moving people out and building out parks and other infrastructure that could, be utilized when weather's good and then become a buffer when, weather is bad and things like that, which they've done such a fantastic job. And I think there's a lot of interesting applications, not only for people who are building out infrastructure and for city planners, but, also for investors and all types of industries that could be utilizing a city simulator to understand the damages of climate change. Have you seen any kind of interesting, clients and people using this for new applications for all sorts of sectors?
Yes, we have. Yeah. So I think, as you said, things like I guess the data and technology we lose, things like decarbonomics in terms of managing existing building portfolio. How do I decarbonize it? Things like City Simulator in terms of making different decisions. And we've used City Simulator in a variety of different arrangements. So I'll give an example of Port Rupert and in Canada, and that this was about looking at how do we the client effectively wants to develop an upgrade to the port facility, and as it continues to expand and grow, and so actually we took a city simulator model and we started to look at what's the impact, where's it best to place the development as a consequence of understanding what those impacts are, building some of those sustainable nature-based solutions that you just described a moment ago into the planning cycle for that, and thinking in the long term. So these assets that we build are around for 100 years, 150 years. So what is it going to be like? And unless you use the technology to think about it, how can you possibly plan effectively? So that's definitely going to be, I think that's a great use of things like City Simulator to help you plan and manage, in a different way. And I know that, clients are looking at that pretty hard. When you look at, from an investor perspective, and I'll perhaps switch back to a tool like Decarbonomics, for example, understanding your building portfolio in terms of its carbon emissions, and then what measures you might take over a sustained period of time to apply interventions. And so for example, we've worked with the UK government to look at the carbon impact of a number of civic buildings around the UK. And and that has led to them thinking about, okay, well, how do I manage my portfolio? What different decisions do I make? Do actually, I've got some space on these things. Do I actually put some renewable energy sources in the
Mm.
space, a wind farm or some other form of
Yeah.
electricity generator because I can? And how does that change the state of my whole infrastructure stock as a consequence of those different decision makings? And so, there are a lot of investment companies looking at that. So, for example, if you were to take a mortgage on a home and you start to look at, do I provide a better mortgage rate for a more sustainable property that I know is going to have a lower carbon impact over time? Perhaps I do. But how do I assess the carbon impact of all the homes in my mortgage pool? And we've had some interest from organisations looking at that type of solution. So I think there are lots of practical examples of that. But going back to the thing at the beginning, if you think of the world as a system, it's a whole system approach that we have to take, isn't it?
Yeah.
So encouraging people to take buy more sustainable homes and through an incentive in a mortgage rate, actually is one way of helping drive
Yeah.
house builders to be more sustainable in terms of the properties they build. So you can have a real influence, can't you, by making small changes to the system which have long reaching and wide ramifications.
Absolutely. And I know that, a lot of organizations are implementing a lot of great incentives like that. And then also kind of building it out as a strategy to have win-wins between increasing their profitability and also being able to, lower their carbon emissions overall. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering, do you kind of have advice for other organizations and business leaders who might be listening to this podcast in terms of how to think of climate resilience as a strategy for the business itself?
Yeah, yeah. So I always think about it in sort of three different steps. So the first one I would say is get your own house in order, right? So as a business, do you really understand what the carbon impact of your assets are, and of the things that you buy, and the way that you run and manage your own organization? So
Yeah.
you know understanding those carbon emissions that you generate as a business. Clearly, there are lots of organizations looking at that. There are lots of
Mhm.
standards going in place to help you measure that so you can benchmark your organization against another one. And there are some investors that will only invest in your company if you really understand that.
Yeah.
But that varies widely around the world at the moment in terms of which governments require you to report on carbon data and which don't. So immediately, we could make a change. But as a business leader, do you really understand the impact of your business on the world from a carbon perspective? And if you don't, I think you should. Okay, so
Yeah.
the second piece is that once you've got that understanding, is how do you build a roadmap around what you're going to do to make a difference? And start to build that into your business planning cycle, and start talking to your investors or your customers, and actually understand what are they expecting of you, because people's buying habits will change, investment habits will change, your
Yeah.
ability to secure funding and loans for your business may well be impacted by how sustainable you are as we move forward. So
Yeah.
what's your roadmap, and how are you informing that roadmap through the insight of your investors, your customers? And so I think that's the second piece. I think the third thing I would say is really thinking then about what you're doing, whatever your organization is delivering, and what impact is what you're delivering having on the downstream. So you've thought about how you manage your own and get your own house in order, and you've thought about how you roadmap it. Now it's a bit more about the sort of doing end of it, and really
Mhm.
understanding, are your products, your services, how are they impacting either more sustainable future, or impacting decarbonisation? And so I think that every organisation should think about that,
Yeah.
you don't have to be required by legislation to do that. You can just do it.
Hmm.
And I was talking earlier about carbon insights, and making carbon visible in terms of things you can do. You can do that, and someone, if you can't do it yourself, someone will be able to help you get an insight into that. And certainly now, when I'm talking to customers, or when I'm encouraging everybody in my organization, whether a customer has asked for that or not, we should just tell them, and we should give them that insight. We should make carbon visible for them. And some customers may choose to do something about that, and I hope many do. Others will decide it's not right for them at that time, but that's
Yeah.
fine, isn't it? Because what we're trying to do is change the system and get people to think about it systematically. So I think anyone can get involved in that, and any organization out there can think
Yeah.
about its impact.
Absolutely. And oftentimes, even kind of taking that approach and going through those 3 steps ends up, resulting in a technology or in an outcome that ends up being regulated later. So,
Yeah,
even if
absolutely.
you're not pushed to do it, sometimes you can lead the industry and then your competitors have to kind of follow the path that you already got a head start on, because you went through that. So that's definitely something I think it's really important for our audience to know. And I know that, AtkinsRéalis has invested in a lot of incredible technologies, regarding actually implementing a lot of these decarbonization solutions, one of them being the CANDO technology, others, being sustainable aviation fuels and a lot of things like that. In terms of, some of the decarbonization technologies that you've seen, which are the ones that you're, most excited about right now?
Yeah, so well, I mean that's great. So it's a broad topic, that is,
Yeah.
So I mean, but you're right, so when you talk about purpose, I think purpose has to infiltrate then through everything that you do,
Mhm.
so when we're looking at our organization and the work that we do, the services we provide to our customers, we are trying to be thought leaders in that
Mhm.
space. And you mentioned something that Sebastian had recorded, a podcast recently about
Yeah.
that, and being thought leaders in the space is important because
Mhm.
we're trying to influence industry, um, um, we're trying to influence government, whatever might be other bodies that are out there. But it's essential to be authentic about that too. And I you've obviously heard the term greenwashing and how people
Mhm.
play things. For me, our purpose drives us,
Mhm.
and that's about being super authentic by applying it through the industries we work in, through the projects that we're engaged on.
Yeah.
That's how we'll make a difference. And so, when you take something like aviation, for example, and the future of flight,
Mhm.
clearly a huge topic, and in terms of everything from electric aircraft and how we minimize the impact on our roads and the impact
Yeah.
on our cities and things like that, and through to the likes of sustainable aviation fuel and the development of new technology that allows you to do that. When you take something like sustainable aviation fuel, clearly there's a difficulty of actually putting the fuel into an aircraft and flying it and it
Right.
working in the right way. But actually, the infrastructure that you need to put in place in airports to drive
Mm.
that move to a new fuel type
Mhm.
is significant. So how do we make that as efficient, as easy, as cheap as possible? So you
Mhm.
help enable that change to sustainable aviation fuel.
Mhm.
How do you move quickly enough in terms of bringing electric flying vehicles into operation? And so how do we take our knowledge from doing that in other sectors and other fields and applying that as quickly as we can to
Yeah.
allow eVTOLs to take to the air? And how do we develop battery factories in the most efficient, lean, and effective way?
Yeah.
The demand for electric vehicles by 2050 is huge. It requires the building of 110 gigafactories around the world, and many of which are beginning to spring up, and they
Yeah.
all need a clean source of fuel, a clean source of
Yeah.
energy, low carbon energy to be able to impact them. So I think there's some really, really exciting developments in those areas that will enable us, to continue that journey towards decarbonisation, because electrification plays such a huge part in that. And
Yeah.
so think about how we do that in the leanest, most effective way is critical. So the other thing that I like, and then a topic that I haven't discussed so far is so I think the looking at nature-based solutions. How do we use the natural
Mhm.
world around us
Yeah.
and nature to help us? It's not just like offsetting. It's not planting a tree for every
Right.
kilometer I've flown and stuff like that. It's actually using you talked about it in New York, and using parts of our landscape to basically act as a buffer to help manage the impacts of climate change, or produce a more sustainable solution for things going forward.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm such a fan of thinking about how do we use the natural world around us as part of
Yeah.
the solution, and that's entirely possible. And
Yeah.
but there is a big challenge that we haven't discussed so far, and it's about equity, and it's about equity in the terms of in the developed world, and in an environment where perhaps we can afford to do things slightly differently, and we can afford to think about carbon. There are many parts of the world that actually can't withstand the impact of a climate change disaster, right? Don't have the resilience to be able to do that, don't have the money to be able to invest in clean power and clean energy generation in the same way that parts of the developed world can, and actually are more likely to be devastatingly impacted by a climate change disaster than perhaps other parts of the world that are more developed and have had a big impact. You look at sea level rise and the impact that will have on our coastal cities, and then you look at where a lot of our coastal cities are, they just don't have the capacity to deal with that. So there is an inequality and a lack of equity in terms of how we think about it. So I haven't got a solution to that, by the way, but I think we have got to increasingly think about how do we ensure that this is a global solution and not a local solution where we are fortunate enough to be able to make key decisions around that working well.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up, equity, and particularly in the scope of kind of climate resilience and nature-based solutions, because I think it's really interesting to see some of the solutions that are coming out, even, in collaboration with indigenous groups, building out certain forests around cities that are working incredibly well. I think that's something that's also really interesting. Just a small forest around these cities can sometimes, reduce the impact of a storm by half, and the damages of that storm. It's so interesting to see that. We had Hindu Ibrahim come on to the podcast as well too, and she works with these nature-based solutions, particularly with indigenous groups. And she mentioned that indigenous people are 5% of the global population, but protect 80% of global biodiversity and hold a lot of these nature-based solutions. And I think it's interesting, everywhere in the world, we're starting to see the implementation of these nature-based solutions. Just planting, a few trees around a coastal area can sometimes reduce, the velocity of the wind actually hitting and damaging a lot of these buildings significantly. So that's really great that you brought that up. I think it's fantastic to see some of the solutions that are, coming about in regards to that.
And do you know, Vanessa, on that, there is nothing new to that. You look back over thousands of years at how people protected property and villages and communities, using nature-based solutions. And to some extent, it's about relearning and sharing things we know that work. And going back to the point we talked about, collaboration and diversity of thought earlier. That's a fantastic example, isn't it, of how different communities bring something different to the party. And allowing those voices, having those voices in the room, is such an essential part of the collaboration that's essential to make the change happen, isn't it? So
absolutely. And I think that, kind of just wanting to kind of give our audience, some last advice to take away some of the key points that we've talked about. A lot of these, individuals, I think, who are listening to this podcast, they have the right mindset. They're showing up for it. They're trying to learn about sustainability, climate resilience, all of these things, and implementing it in their business. But sometimes it ends up being difficult kind of on the operational level. And they're facing challenges on that level. Do you kind of have any advice for our audience about how to start to think about developing a sustainability strategy that's effective in their businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is be curious, and so there are lots of things happening. There are lots of different groups and organizations. There are a lot of engineering consultancies like mine, and there are lots of organizations that can help you and advise you. And but you need to be curious, and you need to be curious about actually what impact could I have? What impact is my business having on the world around me? And how can I help improve my understanding of that? Making things visible helps you get things done. And so, I think understanding that in the first instance is super important. So be really curious. You're not on your own. There are lots of organizations thinking about these types of things. So, reach out to a partner, reach out to a competitor, and ask them what they're doing, and think about it from that perspective. I think, there are lots of, again, different organizations that are, springing up in different parts of the world, and thinking about how do we help businesses, individuals, make a difference. And so, only too happy to probably have your membership, or at least to have a conversation with you about it, and talk about it. And then I think it's, start with things that that you can influence, and so a bit like anything in life, focus is essential to make a difference and get things done. So, what are the one or two things that you can start off with in your organization? The other thing I think is that people care passionately about what's happening, and there will be champions in your organization. They don't need to be specialists necessarily, but they'll be champions because they've got a belief system that says, I need to make an impact and do something about this. So how do you harness the power of your people, and use them to help you develop that roadmap or that insight that you may or may not have? I think if you're more developed, so you've already got perhaps you've got a carbon management plan for your business, perhaps you're looking at how you improve targets. Again, be curious, reach out, find out what others are doing, create a network, and in your industry or your sector, and be prepared to share and learn. And I think that if we go down the route of everyone wanting to invent the new thing themselves, we'll get nowhere. And but actually, if we're curious, open, transparent, sharing, and really want to suck that knowledge in because we just want to be better tomorrow than we are today, then I think that's a vital thing to do.
Absolutely. I think that's fantastic advice, just to really understand what you're doing, get curious about that, listening to all of these voices that might be able to share that idea with you. And then oftentimes, like you said earlier, it ended up snowballing into something even greater than that. The culture almost has kind of a velocity of its own to be able to go towards these solutions and collaborate. So thank you so much for joining us. It was a real honor to learn these insights from you and what AtkinsRéalis is doing, and also your leadership within that. So thank you so much for joining us today. And it was an honor to have you with us.
Great. Thank you very much, Vanessa. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Experts. If you liked the insights from our podcast, feel free to reach out to us on our website. We produce episodes with world-class executives every month and offer exclusive consulting and speaking services globally. Reach out to us and become a leader in your industry.